Welcome to the video on how to verify W3C Verifiable Credential via OID4VP in the walt.id community stack. This video is split into two sections. In the first, we will take a look at the walt.id portal and see how we can verify a W3C Verifiable Credential just using a UI. Afterwards, we will take a look at the API, which is used behind the scenes of the portal to do the verification. Let's start off with the portal. But first, let's take a look at the walt.id web wallet. Here I'm logged in and have two credentials in my wallet, an eID and a bank ID. I will now use the walt.id portal to verify a bank ID by just selecting this credential here, going to verify, and then clicking here the policies which I want to check against. We also offer more policies which you can find in our documentation under docs.walt.id. I will just leave these default ones enabled and click verify. This will create an OID4VP credential request URL, which we also can see if we copy this URL right here and paste it right here. Here we can see this OpenID4VP request URL. We can also take this presentation definition URI and open this up to see what we will request. This presentation definition will be interpreted then later by the wallet to see which credentials it should send to the verifier. And as we can see here, we are requesting a bank ID. Let's now go ahead and use this offer and paste it in our wallet. Next to pasting it directly here, we could also scan it with our mobile phone if we would have the wallet on our mobile phone open, then just scanning this QR code right here. I will now paste it, and here we can see we are requested to present a bank ID, and so I will disclose this information. And as we can see, all of the different policies we selected in the beginning passed and were successful. Let's now jump over to the API level. For this video, we will focus on W3C Verifiable Credentials. Using this OpenID4VP/verify endpoint, we can configure a verification of a credential. Here in this parameter section, we can provide optional parameters to customize, for example, the authorized base URL, which will be provided, provide a success redirect URI, which will then be passed to the wallet. So after a successful verification, the wallet then knows where it should redirect the user. We can also provide a status callback URI, with which we can get information during the verification process in an external system. We can also provide a custom state ID, which would be part of this state parameter here in the OpenID4VP offer. Also, we can define a specific OpenID4VP profile, but for the W3C Verifiable Credentials, we can just leave it empty and therefore leave it as default. Now, when it comes to the body, we can now customize what type of credentials we want to request. Also, what type of policies we want to apply on the presented credentials. By default, and the most basic request looks something like this, where we just request a specific credential with a specific format. So in this case, the short BC-JSON refers to the W3C Verifiable Credential and the type, the Open Badge credential. Now, by default, we will just apply the signature policy. So checking that the signature of the presented credential is valid. But we can also add other policies. If we quickly take a look at the walt.id documentation, we can see that we have these different types of static policies, where here we can also see the signature policy that is applied by default, an expired policy, not before policy, a schema policy, revocation status list policy to check the status of a credential, the holder binding policy. Also, we have different types of parameterized policies where you can add specific parameters to it. So for example, allowed issuer will check that the issuer of the credential is one of the provided ones in the arguments array. Also a webhook policy, which can be used to fully customize what you will verify on the presented credentials, because this webhook policy will be called with the presented credentials, also including the verifiable presentation, which is a wrapper containing the presented credentials. And you can then use those and validate whatever you want, and then just sending back a success or a failure of the credentials that you validated, and this will then be forwarded to the wallet from the walt.id verifier. Now, if we quickly go back to the API and I check out my wallet, I can see that I have a bank ID and an EID. And so let's make sure we request this EID verifiable credential. So I will say here the type I want to request is an EID credential. And so if I execute this, we get back the same OpenID4VP offer URL, which we also had in the portal. And this could then also be rendered as a QR code, or we just use it now here and paste it similar than before right here, and thereby see, okay, we are requested an EID credential and we will present it. Now here we can also see that there's no redirect URL supplied because we left these fields here empty. Now we just presented the credential, but we don't know yet if all the policies have passed. And so what we can do here is we will take our state property. And so we go to this OpenID4VC session ID endpoint, provide the state here, and then see the credential that was presented. And here we can see the VP token, for example, and we can also see, if we scroll down, the policy results. So for example, the verifiable credential, so the verifiable presentation, which is a wrapper around the credential itself that was presented, had a valid signature. We also see that the credential itself, so our EID credential, here was also the signature policy applied, and this also passed. And we also see here the time it took to run the policies and the number of policies in total that were applied. Now, for our next example, what we will do is extend our first request to not only now request one credential, so our EID, but two credentials, also the bank ID. And we will apply a specific policy to the verifiable presentation, so this wrap around the two presented credentials, and make sure this policy will fail. So we provide here the maximum credentials policy and say the argument is 1. So when we now execute this and go back to our wallet and present, we will first see, okay, here are two credentials that should be presented. And so if I'm now disclosing this, we see already that the policy has failed. And if we go back to the API and use our state here again to check the verification results, we will see here that the verification results didn't pass, because here the policy results of this verifiable presentation and policy maximum credentials didn't succeed. But we see that the regular default signature policies were both applied to the bank ID and also to the EID, and both of them were successful. But because one of the policies that we required failed, the whole verification failed. Now, in this next example, we expand our request even more, because now we not only provide a specific policy that should be applied to the verifiable presentation, so this minimum credentials policy, but we also will provide policies that should be applied to all requested credentials. So in this instance, signature and expiration policy should be applied to all of those credentials in this array right here, so the EID and the bank ID. And then we also specifically for the bank ID provide a policy not before that should only be checked against this specific credential, but not this credential. And so when we execute this now and do again a presentation, we see that all of these policies were successful. And so if we check the results, we can also see right here that our verification was a success And here the minimum credentials policy for the verifiable presentation also was a success. The bank ID, we had the signature policy applied, which was a success. We had the expiration policy applied, which was specific for this credential, which was also a success. We had the not before policy, which was also applied here, which was a success. And also here signature and expired, which were both a success for the EID credential. So yeah, the specific policy was here the not before policy, which was a success for the bank ID. Now, every time we craft this type of request body, what happens in the background is that the Verify API creates a so-called presentation definition, which we also have seen in the beginning. So if we execute this again and take this offer and take this request URL and paste it here and check out the presentation definition URI, you will see the presentation definition that was created in the background. So we see here we are requesting an EID credential and a bank ID credential, which does a mapping of this VC type path in the credential. So if we quickly go here in the bank ID, we see this mapping here. So we have the VC and then we have the type, and so we make a mapping of. And so when the wallet receives this, it interprets this presentation definition to figure out what kind of credential or credentials, if it's multiple, should be presented to the verifier. Because it could be that the wallet just has 200 different credentials, and so it needs to figure out which ones now it should actually present. And to make it easy, we built this interface so you don't have to craft this presentation definition yourself. But if you wanted to, you could also do that. So, and here we also have an example where we specifically provide this input descriptor. So we could also provide it directly if we want to customize it in any way. And so this is how it would look like if we now say, okay, we want to request a specific EID credential. So if we execute this and now do again a presentation, we will see that here we are requested an EID, and so we can present that. And this way you get all the flexibility from just having the most minimal example where you just request a specific type of credential and let the default policies be applied, to the more advanced, which we have just seen, where you provide the actual presentation definition object yourself and thereby customize it to your liking. You will find a link to the portal, the API, and also our documentation in the description. If you enjoy our tools, please leave us a star on GitHub, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. And with that, happy building and see you next time.